evening, everybody. I'd like to welcome you all to today's Boundary Commission review meeting. Today's briefing will be led by colleagues from the Local Government Boundary Commission for England. So they're due to deliver a presentation and then they'll take questions at the end. So I'll now hand over so they can introduce themselves and start today's briefing.
Thank you very much. My name's Amanda Nobbs. I'm one of the commissioners at the Local Government Boundary Commission, and I'm the lead commissioner for the review of Telford and Wrekin. And this evening I'm joined by two of my colleagues who I'll just invite to introduce themselves.
Good evening. Thanks for having us this evening. My name's Alison Everson. I'm the Review and Programme Manager at the Commission, so I'll have oversight and be working closely with Amanda and Tom, who will be leading on the review.
Thank you very much. My name's Tom Rutherford. I'm the Lead Review Officer for the Telford and Wrekin electoral review, which means it's my job to be the first point of contact for the council and also take the lead in reading and analysing the evidence as it comes in.
Thank you. And this evening what we'll do is Alison and Tom will give you a presentation which we hope will explain the process, and then we hope very much that through your questions in the chat we'll be able to address your concerns and questions so that you feel that you have a good feel of the process and how to influence it. And there are two things that I'd really like to emphasise right at the start. One is that we really see this review as something that we want to do with you. You know your area best. And so we really do rely on and look forward to your comments and your contributions, which can help us to come up with the best possible arrangements that work locally for you. This isn't something where we've got something in our back pocket that we want to test on you. This is where we really are looking for your local knowledge to feed in and make the best possible review of your area. And then the second thing that I think it's helpful to emphasise at the moment is just the fact that we are from the Local Government Boundary Commission. And I say that because at the moment you may have picked up in the news that there's also a review taking place of parliamentary boundaries. And that might get a little bit confusing, but that is actually a separate process. And so if you have any comments on the parliamentary constituency boundaries, that's to the Electoral Commission. Our process actually feeds into the parliamentary processes. So in 10 or so years' time, if there's another review of parliamentary boundaries, then what we do to decide the local boundaries will feed into the next parliamentary review. But at the moment, it just happens that there are two processes going on at the same time. So with our focus very much on local arrangements for you and the local council, I hand to Tom and Alison.
Thanks, Amanda. So yeah, Tom and I will just go through a brief presentation. There'll be an opportunity for questions at the end, so please do put them in the chat. So first, a bit about us. We recommend fair electoral and boundary arrangements for England. We are completely independent. We don't report to government or any political parties. We report direct to Parliament through a Speakers Committee. We are transparent. Every submission that we receive throughout review is published on our website once it's been redacted of personal details, so people can see how we've reached our decisions, and we publish detailed reports that explain our reasoning. We're very accessible. We seek to be very open, very easy to get hold of. There's only one Tom and one Alison at the Commission. If you call us, we'll be there and happy to help you through any queries that you might have. So what is an electoral review? An electoral review considers the electoral arrangements for Telford and Wrekin Council. This means it looks at just the following things. So the total number of councillors for an authority for Telford and Wrekin, the total number of wards, the locations of the boundaries between each of those wards, and the names of the wards and the number of councillors elected to each of those wards. At the end of the review, we'll make recommendations to Parliament about each of these things in time for your review to be implemented at an all-out election in 2023. So why are we reviewing Telford and Wrekin? We actually received a request from Telford and Wrekin Council. That's the case for several reviews on our programme each year. And the review will make sure that we deliver electoral equality, which we'll go into in a bit more detail. But that basically means each councillor representing roughly the same number of voters. This map, and I'm sorry, it's not all that clear, but it does show the current levels of what we call electoral equality in Telford and Wrekin. So the areas where there's colour show that there's more pink and green broadly in the south of the borough, show that there's significantly more or significantly fewer electors than the average.
Is now joining.
While there's no really poor electoral equality, there is still some improvement, so we will be looking at that. So what do we mean by electoral equality? Ideally, every councillor would represent around the same number of electors. In a perfect world, looking something like this. However, over time, a number of things can happen which alter the number of electors different councillors represent. For example, you might see a number of houses built in some wards, bringing new electors to some wards, but not others, and not in equal amounts. You might also have a university or a high rate of registration in a part of the authority, bringing a high number of new electors to one or a few wards, depending on the distribution. You might have some people leave the area, altering the number of electors in some wards, and you might have people moving from one part of the district to another. So you can see how an area might become imbalanced over time, and we're going to try and address this imbalance over the course of the review. However, we also try to future-proof our proposed wards by taking into account things like housing developments and population changes. And we really don't just focus on the numbers. It's really important that wards reflect local communities and that they use sensible and identifiable boundaries. And we have to strike a balance. I'll talk about that a little bit more in the coming slides. So reviews are split into 4 phases. Phase 1, which has now been completed, is concerned with councillor numbers, so the total number of councillors elected to Telford and Wrekin. Based on the evidence received during this first phase, the Commission has decided that Telford and Wrekin should have 54 councillors, which is the same as there are now. I should just say that there is some flexibility through the review to change this number by 1 or 2, if that would provide for a better pattern of wards. Following the council size stage, we then move on to our current phase of the review, which is warding arrangements. And this is really important at this stage for the people in this room. During this stage, we consult with the local community and we draw up a set of new warding arrangements for the area. Once we propose our final recommendations for new warding arrangements, we go through a parliamentary process to make the new arrangements law. And the last phase is implementation, which refers to the election at which the new wards are used for the first time, which, as I said, will be in 2023. As I said, we're currently in phase 2 of the process, and Tom's going to talk to you now a little bit more about how this stage works and what we're looking for from yourselves in terms of the community and how you can get more involved.
Thanks a lot, Alison. The warding phase of the review process is very much based on consultation with local people. We don't know your area anywhere near as well as you do, and so we will be relying on you to give us your views on a pattern of wards that makes the most sense across Telford and Wrekin. There's going to be at least 2 opportunities for you, as well as everybody else across the borough, to tell us what you think and to influence the outcome of the review. The first opportunity, as some of you know, is right now. We're currently in the first consultation period, which opened last month and currently open until the 2nd of August. During this time, we're asking local people to tell us where they think the new wards should go. People can give us ideas for the whole borough if they like, but we're equally happy to hear ideas about particular neighbourhoods or smaller parts of the borough. I'll talk more about the kinds of evidence we'd like to see in a moment. Once the first consultation period's closed, we go through all the submissions and evidence and come up with a set of draft proposals based on what we've heard. We then publish these proposals and consult on them again, giving local people a chance to tell us what we've got right, what we might have got wrong, and what we should change. This second consultation period opens on the 2nd of November and runs until the 10th of January next year. We'll publish interactive maps and reports outlining how we reached our draft proposals so people can understand how we came up with the suggestions. Once the second consultation is closed, we'll then go away, read everything, assess the evidence, make any changes that we think are necessary based on the views of local people. We'll then publish final recommendations on the 29th of March next year. Once the final recommendations have been published, they are set and they can't be changed after that point. Sometimes, if necessary, we might be persuaded to hold a third round of consultation if we want to test some suggestions that are very different from what we originally proposed. This further consultation, usually just restricted to 1 or 2 areas if it's needed, but it can help us clarify our thinking if we receive some good alternatives during the consultation on our draft proposals. When you're telling us your views, there are some key things you should know. We're bound by law to consider arguments relating to 3 things when drawing up new wards. We call these our 3 statutory criteria. First criterion is electoral equality. We will seek to propose wards that mean that each councillor represents roughly the same number of electors. However, we don't demand absolutely perfect electoral equality. It's also important that the wards that we propose reflect local communities and use clear and identifiable boundaries. That brings us on to our other 2 criteria. The second is community interests and identities. We look to propose wards that keep communities together and reflect the shape of local communities in the area. This is something that we very much rely on local people to tell us. Finally, convenient and effective local government. We try to propose wards that are coherent, that use sensible and identifiable boundaries, that have complete internal road links, and that have names that mean something to local people. I'll talk a bit more detail about each of these, but before I do, it's important to say that all of these criteria are equal. We don't aim to get the equality right and then shoehorn those into communities. These are 3 criteria equally weighted that we have to strike the balance of based on the evidence we receive. First criteria, as I mentioned, electoral equality. When we propose new wards and calculate electoral equality, the legislation says that we have to take account of how many electors are going to be living in the area 5 years after the review ends. In Telford Wrekin's case, that's 2027. To do that, we've worked with the council's officers to come up with a set of 5-year electorate forecasts for each polling district in the area. The idea behind this is to try to future-proof electoral equality for each of the wards that we propose. This spreadsheet is available on the Telford Wrekin page of our website, and you can play around with it to see how your proposals would impact electoral equality in the future. Our aim is to propose a set of wards that all have electoral variances within 10% of the average for the borough by 2027. That's electoral equality, but as I mentioned, it is important to the Commission that the new wards reflect local communities and that local people get in touch to tell us about their communities. A sense of communities shaped by the amenities and services that people use, as well as by local groups and organisations such as parish councils. Things that might define a community are shops, schools, other places of education, residents' associations, leisure facilities, places of worship. Telling us about how you use these kinds of facilities, amenities and organisations and how relevant they are to your sense of place helps us to understand where the communities exist and how to draw boundaries that reflect them. Sometimes what looks like a dividing feature on a map is actually a uniting feature to a community. We've got an example here from a recent review in Rochdale, and you can see there appears to be a fairly clear dividing line on the map along the black boundary, which I've just highlighted here. There are 2 expanses of land I've highlighted that look like they divide the communities to the north and the south. In the first round of consultation, we didn't hear very much about the communities in this area, so we went with what we thought was a stronger boundary as part of our draft proposals. What we heard during the consultation was the exact opposite. local people wrote in to tell us that rather than being large patches of land that separated communities, these areas are actually nature reserves that are a uniting feature, drawing people together from both sides. So it actually divided their sense of community. You can see here some of the things we were told, with pictures of the nature reserve, an online community dedicated to the preservation of these areas for local people. You can even see from this aerial shot how their evidence is reflected by access on the ground, with footpath access from the housing estates on both sides. We found this community evidence very persuasive, and we changed our draft recommendations to make sure we weren't splitting a community with our warding proposals. You can see this on the final map, very different from what we originally had proposed. The final criteria is effective and convenient local government. We look for strong and identifiable boundaries that make sense on the ground, and for ones that make it as easy as possible for councillors to represent their areas. We look for ward names that mean something to local people. You can see here a good example of a motorway that goes right through an authority area. Clearly, it's a very strong boundary. It may well divide communities, and it's like, if we use that as a boundary, it's likely to provide for effective and convenient government. So any submission that you do send to us should consider these 3 criteria. In particular, please tell us about your communities and how they can best be reflected in a pattern of wards. And do also give us reasons for something you're proposing. If you want a particular boundary or a particular ward, don't just tell us you want that ward, tell us why you want that ward or that boundary. It's the why that's most important. There's a few things that we can't consider when we're doing the review. We're politically independent. We don't care which party might or might not be elected in a proposed ward. In most cases, the map is going to have to change to accommodate a different number of councillors or to achieve electoral fairness. That process is going to have knock-on effects across the borough. It means the status quo is often not a viable option. As Amanda said earlier on, parliamentary boundaries are dealt with under a separate set of rules and by a separate body. They build constituencies from our wards, not the other way around. Our review can't change postcodes or addresses, and we've got no evidence that there's any impact on house prices or insurance premiums. And finally, this review is only concerned with the internal ward boundaries for Telford and Wrekin. We are unable to amend the external boundaries between Telford Wrekin and any adjoining authorities as a part of this review. I think we have some representatives from parishes here tonight. We do have some very specific rules about parishes during an electoral review, and it's important to be aware of them if you're putting in a submission on behalf of a parish council. We can't create or abolish parishes as part of an electoral review. That's done as part of a separate process called a community governance review, which is the responsibility of Telford and Wrekin Council, not the Commission. And amend the external boundaries of any parishes as part of an electoral review. Again, that's for a community governance review. If we draw a ward boundary through a parish, we have to create a parish ward to reflect that boundary. And finally, and most importantly, we always write to every parish council at the start of every consultation stage. Parishes know a lot about how the communities in their area work, and that's very valuable information for us. Right, quite quickly, the final step of the review process is parliamentary approval. Once the warding pattern phase is finished and we've published final recommendations, we turn the proposals into law by presenting them to Parliament. We lay an order in both houses for scrutiny, and once the order's laid, it goes through something called the negative resolution procedure, which means it has to sit there for 40 days without objection. It is important to note, Parliament can only reject or agree our recommendations as a whole. It can't make any changes to the orders. The LGBCE was set up in 2010 and, touch wood, none of our orders have been rejected over the last 11 years. If no objection is made by any parliamentarian, the order automatically becomes law and will be implemented at the next local elections in 2023. So to recap the timeline of the review, phase 1 is the preliminary period, which has been completed. We're now in phase 2, and we're consulting on warding patterns until early August this year. Following that, we have the publication of draft recommendations in November, followed by a 10-week consultation running until the 10th of January next year. We'll publish the final recommendations in March, or certainly aim to, pending any further consultation that's necessary. The changes should be approved by Parliament next summer, and the implementation of the new electoral arrangements will be at the elections in May 2023. There are lots of ways to make a submission over the course of our consultation periods. You can email or write to us using the email or postal address that's on the screen, and I will flash this up again at the end for people to see. You can also put in a submission to our consultation portal, which shows an interactive map of the current wards, and when we publish draft recommendations, you'll be able to overlay those recommendations and see where we are. So that's plenty from me. What can we help you with in terms of questions?
Thank you, Tom. And as Tom says, questions now.
I think we've got one question in the chat from Councillor Vaughan Hodgkinson, who's saying Brookside was pink. Does that mean there were too many people or too few? So if we go back to the map, again, I'll flash this up on the screen.
I can tell you that one, Tom. Brookside, which has got 2 councillors, each of those councillors represents 14% fewer electors than the average. And the outlier going the other way is Horsey and Lightmoor, and the 2 councillors there represent 18% more electors than the average for Telford and Wrekin.
But I think it's also worth just adding that the first round of consultation, we would really encourage you to think from a blank piece of paper and start again, rather than think of this in terms of tweaking the boundaries of existing wards, because that is certainly the approach that we take. We don't look at the existing and adjust. We actually start again with a blank piece of paper and look at all the evidence we've got on where the communities are and where people are suggesting to us that the boundaries between communities might lie. And I think it's helpful to be aware, expect change. It is very unusual in a review. It's the exception for a boundary not to change.
Is there anything else? Any other questions either in the chat or people want to put their hands up? Yeah, one more from Councillor Vaughan Hodgkinson asking how often this process takes place. Alison, you're the programme manager for the Commission. How often are we going to be coming back to Telford and Wrekin?
Well, we actually did do a review of Telford and Wrekin not so long ago, so it's quite unusual that we are back as soon as we are. So typically we do a review every 15 years, so it is unlikely. Hopefully we'll get this one really right and we'll reflect the communities and the development that you've got coming, and then you won't see us again, hopefully for 12 to 14 years.
Okay. Yes, can we go to Mr. Wilson, and then we've got one more question in the chat.
Yeah, thank you very much. I don't know where this gets built in. Do you consider the stuff around future carbon zero features, i.e. transportation and that sort of thing, when it comes to the electoral sections because of transportation?
Yeah, we certainly look for wards that are easy to travel around, whether that's by private transport or public transport. We look for wards that make sense and are easy to get around to. We're probably not going to propose a ward that sort of has 2 blocks of electors a fair way apart with a very narrow corridor between them. or anything like that. I don't think necessarily we specifically refer to carbon zero, but if you think that that's relevant, if you think that that's something that would be helpful, more than happy to put that in a submission.
Okay,
I
thank
think
you.
that's a really helpful example of where each review is different, and we very much respond to what is important to you. And one of the variables is actually how the councillors are distributed to the wards. So at the moment you have a mixed pattern of 2, 3 and single member wards, and you may want to take that into consideration when you make suggestions to us on how councillors might be allocated across the different wards in order to influence the distances that people have to travel. Although I think it's also helpful to think in the round about new ways of working and not always necessarily needing to physically travel to make things happen these days in local government.
Thanks for that thought.
Yes, we've got one question in the chat from Anthony, who says, to drive or walk from Shorebirch ward to Wellington's other wards, it's necessary to drive through Apley and Lee Gomery. Can this be looked at? In other words, can the outer perimeter of the Wellington Town Council area be looked at? The short answer to that is the outer perimeter of the Wellington Town Council area, as I mentioned with regard to the parishes, that's not something that we can touch in this review. That's something that Telford and Wrekin Council may well wish to look at in a community governance review. We do encourage councils to make sure that the parishes and town council areas continue to reflect communities. However, when it comes to moving around a particular ward, yes, we will look to enable a ward that is easy to travel around, where you don't have to leave the ward to get to certain aspects of it. We can't always promise that because we have to balance the criteria, and sometimes the geography is not in our favour, but we will do our best to accommodate that.
Okay, are there any more questions from anybody? Oh, I've seen another hand being raised again. Mr. Wilson again.
Yeah, sorry about that. Telford is an area that is built up around a series of donuts, if you haven't noticed it already, where you got the central town and then the wards that spiral out, which is what Anthony's like referring to. So obviously that in itself presents problems when you're representing people, because there's different aspects within those regions. Is there any way that this reform has any way in balancing up that, or is it non-invasive in that term? In other words, it doesn't try to graduate the population across those boundaries, social boundaries?
I think we're really in your hands in terms of what you think the boundaries should be. So Telford and Wrekin is quite an unusual borough in how the population is distributed. But if you can tell us how those communities that spiral out of Telford work as a community and put those into a pattern of wards that makes sense, then we will respond to that. Okay. I think if you have got, you can choose how many members per ward you think there should be. So that is sometimes a really easy way to make sure that you reflect communities. So sometimes you'll get a population of an area that is exactly entitled to 2 councillors. Sometimes it's entitled to 4 councillors. So in that regard, you'll have to think about whether or not two councillor wards would be better, or the best distribution of the population between the wards. And we have no particular fixed view about how the communities are best reflected, and we don't really know. So that's why we really want to hear from you, because all we know is what we can see on the map. So what you can tell us about how the individual communities in Telford work together and how they're separate from each other as well, that's where we really get the value in from what you tell us.
Okay, thank you very
And
much.
one of the really satisfying things about working in a local government boundary review is that we really can be responsive to local circumstances, and the outcome can be very different in different places. In some local authorities and for some communities, then people welcome the idea of having great variety and richness in the community and the people that you're bringing together in a community. In other parts of the country, that you get more of a desire to put similar types of housing communities together. And it's very much a matter of responding to what you would like and what works to you and what you see as your community within Telford and Wrekin.
Okay, we've got one more question in the chat, but first, should we go to Anthony, who's got his hand up? Anthony, you may have to take yourself off mute. No? Okay, one more question in the chat from Helen Gordon. Are there past examples that I could look at for best practice? Alison, do you want to?
Sorry, trying to get myself off mute. I'm just trying to see if there's any ones that are local to Telford. I think we had some good representations from some London boroughs. It is a very different type of area, but it's about the community. So if you look at the review of Newham, you'll see some good examples. East Suffolk was conducted a little while ago, but we got some helpful information from them. If you look at Waldringfield Parish Council proposal, they gave us a pretty short representation after the draft recommendations were published, saying we think that we should be with these parishes and not these parishes, and they gave us a list of 3 or 4 reasons why, and the Commission decided just from that one submission to change its draft recommendations to something which had poorer electoral equality, but was really justified by quite simple information about how the community works.
And I think the thing that I would want to emphasise is that it's actually very accessible and easy to share information that is helpful to us. It's not like some of the planning consultations where it's an incredibly technical process where you have to understand a lot of jargon and rules and processes. It's things like, my children go to school here, I get the bus here, I go to this health centre. Another useful example, I think, is a road. You know, sometimes a road is a dividing line between communities, and sometimes it's the heart of the community and a focal point, and you will know that and we don't. And so please, you know, it's very simple snippets of information about what is meaningful to you in your area or the people that you work with is what really makes a difference to our reviews. It doesn't have to be technical. The only thing I would really emphasize is that as Tom mentioned, that little word why. If you just suggest something and you don't say why, it's very hard for us to take it into account. But if you just give some very simple reasons why, doesn't have to be technical, detailed, long, then it's really powerful and we can take account of that.
Yeah, another question from Anthony about the Wellington Town Council external boundaries. We have a situation where agricultural land in Rockwardine, I do hope I'm pronouncing that correctly, has been built on in the past year and access is only onto Haygate Road, Wellington. This new development should be part of Wellington. As I said, we cannot, as part of this review, change the boundaries of the town councils. What we can do is propose ward boundaries that reflect communities and potentially tee them up for a subsequent community governance review that Telford and Wrekin Council has to undertake. Telford and Wrekin Council is the authority with the power to change the town and parish council's boundaries. That's not us. What I would suggest is send us in a submission with the details of the area that you want to move into as part of Wellington. If it fits in with all the other submissions, if we're persuaded by the evidence, we can certainly put that area as part of a Wellington-based ward, and then you can make the case for a community governance review, which Telford and Wrekin Council have to conduct if they receive a petition with a certain number of signatures. Off the top of my head, I can't remember exactly how many. The Telford and Wrekin Council are then under a duty to undertake the review, and you can make the argument for the expansion of Wellington Town Council area there.
Okay, does anybody have any other questions that they'd like to ask at this point? Just give people a few minutes in case something comes through on the chat.
Yes, we have a hand up from Councillor Jawa.
Okay.
Yes, hello everybody. I represent Gatley and Overdale, and as you can see, the Lowly area is part of my ward, and it has grown like a mushroom. And it's, I think towards the end of 27, they're going to have, if we keep it as it is, going to be over 12,000 dwellings. And the same thing is happening in Horsey and Lightmoor. There's a lot of development going on there. So that needs to be looked into, because in Gatley itself, there are very distinctive 3 or 4 areas, the old ones, and the Lowly is totally new area. And I mean, that needs to be looked into in conjunction with Horsey and Lightmoor. And that area or Lowly, that's all new development. You know, if we can look into saying that, you know, if we can create a one Lowly ward, and Gatley Overdale stays, loses part, the access part, and Lightmoor and Horsey lose access part. And if we can balance equation in that order, something to think about.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Now, I mean, we can't take formal consultation submissions as part of this meeting, but certainly the Lawley area is somewhere that we are well aware of. It's in the development figures, it's got a very high number of projected new electors going forward. It's obviously going to be a key point for this review.
Okay, thank you. Just wanted to point out, you know, that there are very, very old communities in Gatley and Overdale, and there are new communities in Horsey and Lawley, and you know, if we can come up some sort of suggestion to make sure that all the communities stay together, they are not separated, because Gatley is the main, because it includes Gatley, Red Lake, Overdale, the Rock, and part of Newdale. They're all associated with Gatley itself. They identify them as Gatley. So that's my, my suggestion is that we can work on those lines. Thank you.
I think that kind of information is really helpful, and if people articulate that to us just with the simple explanations, as Amanda said, about why those areas are communities, because if we look at those areas on the map, we might not be able to make those distinguish between those areas. So the more kind of layers of information and the more letters that people write to us and emails that people send to us, the more we will understand and the more we'll build up a picture of where the communities are. So it's exactly that kind of level of detail about the differences between older communities and newer communities, areas which haven't even got people living in them yet. So telling us exactly those kind of things would be really helpful.
Thank you.
And it's especially when there is new development planned, to get information on how people think that those new electors are going to relate to existing communities is gold dust to us when we're doing these reviews. I wonder whether it's worth just adding in one other comment while people are just thinking whether there are any more questions. Something that I think it's helpful just to emphasise is that if there's something that you like in the proposals as the consultation goes on, please do let us know, because sometimes there's a tendency that if you don't like something, you get in touch with us. And then we make a lot of changes to try to respond to the messages that we're getting and the feedback that we're getting from people. And if there's a silent majority that liked something that we don't know about, there's a real danger that we might unravel it and make quite a significant change that comes as a horrible surprise to you in the next round of consultation. So it's really helpful to us if you can tell us what you like as well as what you don't like.
Thank you. Just one last check that we've got no more questions. No, okay. Tom, were you just going to recap on ways that people could get in contact with you?
I was, yes. If I can just share the slide again that has our contact details on it. We're happy to receive representations in any written form, email, post, or the consultation portal. If you've got any questions about the process equally, drop us a line. We do try to help. We do appreciate that we can't get this right without the help of Telford and Wrekin and the people who live there, and we're keen to make the process as easy and pain-free as possible.
Okay, so thank you for everyone's time. Thanks to the Commission for that really useful presentation, and thank you for all the questions that you've asked tonight. And please get in contact with the Commission if you've got any comments that you want to put forward. As you've just heard, you know, they really want to hear what you've got to say and your thoughts. So I'll bring this meeting to a close. Thank you, everybody.